Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the third in this three-part series of video presentations about Death in the Compass. In the first presentation, I talked a little bit about Death in the Compass as a piece of detective fiction. In the second presentation, I talked about the importance of symmetry or symmetrical relationships in Death in the Compass. And then in this third presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the Jewish element in Death in the Compass. If you've read the piece, you will know that a full understanding and appreciation of the piece requires some knowledge certain aspects of Jewish theology and religious practice. And I wanted to mention a few of these just to sort of guide your reading along. Much of the information I'll give here can be found in the documents that we posted on Blackboard, but I thought it might be useful to give you a kind of guided tour of those documents, and at least in one case, to go into some more detail. So hopefully this will give you a sense of the background of the story, what it is that Borges is thinking as he's writing the story, and to some extent what he expects his readers to bring to the story in terms of their own background knowledge. Okay, cool. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see what I'm seeing. The first thing we need to note, the sort of key Jewish motif in the story, is what is called the Tetragrammaton. Now, if you've read the story, you will know that the Tetragrammaton provides a kind of framework within which the various crimes that Leonard is investigating unfolds. There's a document on Blackboard about the Tetragrammaton, so take a look at that, but I'm also going to try to explain it in a little more detail here. Okay, so if we look at the word Tetragrammaton, the first thing that you should notice is that the Tetragrammaton is not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word. And if you were paying attention to the last presentation on symmetry, you may already have a sense of what Tetragrammaton means. You can see perhaps that it's composed of two Greek words, so tetra and grammaton. And tetra, as you'll recall from our discussion of tetrarch, perhaps from the last presentation, just means four. So tetra means four. Grammaton is related to the Greek word gramma, which just means letter. A letter in the sense of a letter of the alphabet, not like a letter that you send to a friend. So the Tetragrammaton is like the four-lettered thing, or the four letters. That's the basic idea. In Hebrew, the Tetragrammaton looks like this. So it's made up of, as you can probably tell, four individual Hebrew consonants. This one, this one, this one, and this one. I want to say a couple of things about the Tetragrammaton, about how it works, about some difficulties and mysteries associated with it, and hopefully this will give you a sense of what it is that Borges is thinking as he's writing this story. So the first thing to note is that the Tetragrammaton here in Hebrew is made up of four letters, and it's Hebrew is read right to left, like all Semitic languages, Arabic, for instance. And it's made up of these letters. So the first letter here is a yod, a yod. This little mark here, a yod. And the yod generally makes a Y sound. Sometimes it functions as a vowel, but in this case, since it begins a word, it's pretty clear that it's supposed to make a consonantal sound, like a Y, or roughly equivalent to a Y in English. The second letter, as you can see here, is a he. A he. This is like a form of the H where you don't rub your vocal cords together, right? So he, as opposed to che, which is a different letter in Hebrew. And that generally makes a kind of a soft H sound. The third letter is a wa. It's a vav in modern Hebrew, but in biblical Hebrew, it seems to have made a kind of a W sound. And then, of course, the last letter here is another he, so it repeats the second letter. So these are the four letters of the Tetragrammaton transliterated into English. Okay, makes sense. Now, a couple of things about the Tetragrammaton. First, the Tetragrammaton in the Old Testament, at least, let me reduce my font size a little bit. The Tetragrammaton in the Old Testament, at least, is a name given to God, but it's not just any name given to God. It is God's, whoa, how about not 400 pointing? It is not any name given to God. It is God's personal name, his private name, the name associated with the God of the Israelites in particular. There are other names in the Hebrew Bible by which God can be called. For instance, sometimes he's called Elohim, which is just a standard name for God in Hebrew. You'll also find this word from time to time, Adonai, Adonai, which is the standard word for Lord. These are not personal names, however, they are offices, they're functions. The Tetragrammaton, this YHWH sound here, is God's personal and private name. Now, this has a number of implications for Jewish theology and religious practice. The first is that the name of God, the personal name, the Tetragrammaton, has attached to it a kind of a sense of mystery and awe and power. So it's not a generic name. It doesn't name an office or a function. It's God's personal and private name. Like my sort of personal name is Adam, and my function is teacher, or something like that. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the Tetragrammaton, because it's God's personal and private name and not the name of an office or a function, carries some obscurities with it. So this won't perhaps be difficult to grasp, but among observant Jews, in observant Jewish practice, the name of God that is expressed by the Tetragrammaton is generally not pronounced out loud. So if you go to an observant Jewish synagogue and they're reading the text in Hebrew, when the rabbi comes to a portion of the text where the Tetragrammaton appears, it will generally be substituted for one of the other generic names of God. Now, this is just an expression of humility, of reverence, of awe in the face of the personal, private name of God. It also gives us a sense of the degree to which, in certain kinds of Jewish practice, the name Yahweh is supposed to have a kind of power or mystery associated with it. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, as a result of this tendency not to pronounce the name of the Tetragrammaton, to substitute it for other more generic terms, is that we really don't know how the Tetragrammaton is pronounced. Now, you might think that's somewhat mysterious because we have the letters up there at the top and how they appear, presumably just make the sound that those letters make. That's true, but there's an additional complication. In Hebrew, like in most Semitic languages, Arabic for instance, the letters of the alphabet are all consonants. They all make consonantal sounds. And this means, of course, that we don't always know how to link the different consonants with vowels. So we don't know, for instance, if it's sort of Y plus an A vowel, or Y plus an E vowel, or Y plus an O vowel, and then H plus an A vowel, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Now, this is the case with all Hebrew to some degree, at least all biblical Hebrew. As a result of this complexity, Hebrew scholars began to introduce what is called a vowel pointing system. That is to say, they began to introduce vowel sounds sort of around the consonantal letters to give us a sense of how it is, or to give the reader a sense of how it is that these consonants ought to be linked together by vowels. But because the name, the Tetragrammaton, which is now generally pronounced Yahweh, because that name was not pronounced, the vowel pointing was often omitted. Even in the sort of earliest vocalized or texts with vowels, the pointing was omitted, and so it's not clear even now how the name is supposed to be pronounced. I want to give you a sense of what this system of vowel pointing looks like in Hebrew. So I've pulled up a Hebrew text here. This is from Genesis 2:7. So this is the second creation story. And if you look carefully, you will see that above, in some cases, and below, in most cases, the consonants, there are these little dots, points, lines, and so on. Well, these are the vowel sounds. That is to say, they are present to indicate how it is the consonants are linked together by vowel sounds. You will also probably have noticed that the word Yahweh is in this passage, and you will see that it's pointed in a particular way. That's the technical term to describe the adding of vowel points or vowel markers to the consonants of a Hebrew word. So this is a passage, as I said, from Genesis 2:7, from the second creation story. And if we go back to the beginning again, it reads right to left. And we'll see here that the passage says, or it begins by saying, va, va. This is just the word for and in Hebrew, va. And then we have yeser, yeser, which means formed or molded, va, yeser. And then we come to the tetragrammaton. And in this case, it's pointed with this initial vowel point, which indicates a schwa sound, which is like an sound. And then here we have another vowel point that indicates an sound. So we have Yahweh, Yahweh. So we have Va Yeser Yahweh Elohim at Adam, at Adam. Yeah? And this means and Yahweh Elohim, and God, the God, or and the God Yahweh formed, and then here the man. This is the word Adam, or he Adam, which is the definite article, like the. Yeah? And this is, of course, the Hebrew word for human being, Adam. So, and the God Yahweh formed Yeser at Adam. Yeah? So there's the tetragrammaton in context. So the point of this explanation is, first of all, to draw your attention just to sort of how the tetragrammaton looks, what it looks like in Hebrew, but also to indicate something of the mystery that surrounds it for the reasons that I've attempted to explain, having to do with a certain reticence on the part of the Jewish community to pronounce the name out loud. Cool? All right, so that's a little bit about the tetragrammaton. The next concept that I want to talk about very briefly is the concept of rabbi or rabbinical. So you learn in the opening passage of the story that Marcelo Yarmolinsky is a rabbi. Well, what is a rabbi? Well, a rabbi is just a teacher. In contemporary Judaism, and this has been the case for thousands of years now, the rabbi is a kind of formal function, a formal office, something like a combination of scholar, teacher, and pastor, something like that in a Christian context. So Yarmolinsky is a rabbi. He's a student of Jewish history. He's a student of Jewish theology. He's a student of Jewish religious practice. Yeah? That's the second term. The third term, we'll go to the second page, is Talmud. So we know from the story that Yarmolinsky is participating in the third Talmudic conference. And the word Talmud just means something like instruction or teaching. It comes from this biblical Hebrew word lamad, which means to instruct or to teach. This gives us a sense of what Talmud is like, but in general, Talmud is it's sort of like it begins in the Jewish community as sort of an oral reservoir of teaching about the law, about customs, about religious practices. It's sometimes called the oral law, to distinguish it from the Torah, which is the written law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Over time, the Talmud came to be written down in a couple of different versions. So there are various versions of the Talmud, but they all attempt to preserve what was originally a kind of orally transmitted set of instructions or teachings about Jewish religious practice, religious culture, the sorts of things that are expected of you on a daily basis. So this is what it is that Yarmolinsky is interested in. He's a scholar of this. Very well. Okay, so in addition to Talmud, the term Kabbalah comes up in the text. This is an important term as well. So Kabbalah, sometimes pronounced Kabbalah, is just one of the versions of Jewish mysticism. So perhaps you're familiar with mysticism from other contexts. Maybe you've read some of the Christian mystics like St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, just to mention the Spanish examples. Maybe you're familiar with Islamic mysticism, say Sufi mysticism in Islam. Mysticism in general, and most religions at any sort of stage of substantial development will produce a mystical strain. And mysticism in general is an attempt through a series of practices and prayer and reading to attain a kind of union or oneness with the divine. That is generally the goal of mysticism. Unlike other forms of mysticism, say Sufi mysticism or Christian mysticism, the Kabbalah is a mysticism of the text. So it's a mysticism that focuses on not so much sort of mystical experiences induced by practices of fasting and purgation and prayer, but a mysticism based on mystical interpretations of the Hebrew scriptures. So, and this is definitely reducing an enormously complex phenomenon to a few words. So obviously these generalizations will not apply in all cases, and they won't even apply perfectly in any case, but they should give you an idea of what's going on. So mystical interpretation, the idea that the words of the biblical text, even the individual letters of the biblical text, harbor secret special meanings. And that if you can sort of penetrate those meanings, you can learn things about God, about his will, and so on that you wouldn't be able to learn from a sort of straightforward, literal reading of the text. So in this sense, Kabbalah is the mystical variant, the mystical version of Judaism, but it's based on a kind of mystical hermeneutics, that is to say, an act of mystical interpretation, trying to find secret and hidden meanings in the text of the scripture. And this is important, of course, for Borges' story. In a certain kind of way, you can think of Lohnrot as engaged in this sort of mystical interpretation of not the biblical text, of course, but of the reality that surrounds him. So he's a kind of Kabbalist, but a detective Kabbalist, a Kabbalist of crime rather than a Kabbalist of the mystical meaning of the Hebrew scripture. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some idea of what's going on in the text. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. We're happy to answer any questions you have. That'll be all for now, and we'll be in touch.